It's Miss Early here, and today we are going to be learning about quadrilaterals. So the first thing we want to think about when looking at the word quadrilaterals is that we can actually tell a lot just from the name itself. The prefix quad means four, and the word laterals means lines. So this means four lines, specifically any two-dimensional figure with four lines. So as you can see, all of these, even though they look extremely different, and they are all different in a lot of ways, they do all share one thing in common, which is that they can be classified as a quadrilateral because they have four lines. Now we are going to be talking about some different ways we can classify these into subcategories based on different attributes that each one of these shapes has. So there are a couple things that you want to think about when classifying your shape. You want to think about, does my shape have any 90-degree angles? Now remember, 90-degree angles look like this. They are shaped like an L, and if your shape has any 90-degree angles, you want to know how many. Are all four of them 90 degrees, or what? Next, you want to look at if your shape has any parallel lines. Now remember, for lines to be parallel, they need to look like this or like this. And this would be considered a set, and this would be considered a set. So does your shape have any parallel lines, or you also want to know how many sets? And then finally, you want to think about, are my sides equal? And if your sides are equal, you want to think about, are only two sets of sides equal, or are all four equal in length? I'll add that, in length. So a parallelogram is a quadrilateral that has two sets of parallel lines. So if these go forever, they will never touch each other. Same with this pair. They could go forever and never touch each other. And they also have congruent opposite lines. So congruent means to be the same length. So sides A and B are congruent. They are equal in length. And sides C and D are congruent. They are equal in length. So remember, when you're looking at a parallelogram, they're going to have two sets of parallel lines and their opposite sides and their opposite angles. So that would be there and there, and there and there, are going to be congruent, which means they are going to be the same. They are going to be equal, whether it's in length or in degree. Now, the next quadrilateral we're going to talk about is a rectangle. And a rectangle is actually also a parallelogram because look, it has two sets of parallel lines. These lines will never intersect when they extend. And so a rectangle has a few attributes that can help you classify them. So they always are going to have four 90-degree angles. So you can see here that all four of these are L-shaped angles. They are 90-degree angles. So rectangles are always going to have four 90-degree angles. Also, rectangles are always going to have the opposite sides are going to be equal. So here we have side A and B and side C and D. Those are equal in length. They are congruent. So we are going to also say that the opposite sides are congruent. And do not forget that a rectangle is also considered a parallelogram. So the next quadrilateral is a square, and a square is also considered a parallelogram because it has two sets of parallel lines. So both of these sets of lines will never intersect no matter how far they extend. So it is considered a parallelogram just like a rectangle was. Another thing about a square that's similar to a rectangle is the fact that there is four 90-degree angles. So all four of these angles are equal. They are all 90 degrees. But something different about a square that is not a quality of a rectangle is the fact that all four of the sides, so A, B, C, and D, are all congruent. So remember, a square is going to have 4 90-degree angles, 4 equal sides, and 2 sets of parallel lines. So a rhombus is also another quadrilateral, and this one is also a parallelogram because if you look here, we have 2 sets of lines that will never intersect when they are extended. So it is also considered a parallelogram, just like a rectangle, just like a square. So a rhombus is similar to a square in many ways. All sides are going to be congruent in a rhombus. They're all going to be equal, just like in a square. So here, sides A, B, C, and D will all be equal to each other. Another quality of a rhombus is that the opposite angles are going to be congruent. So here the green are congruent and then the orange are congruent. Now this is different from a square because a square, all of the angles were the same. So there is a big difference that's extremely important. So this seems awfully similar to a square. So let's hop back over to the square and let's look and see if it can also be considered a rhombus. Are all sides congruent? Yes, we discovered that A, B, C, and D are all congruent. And are the opposite angles congruent? Yes, opposite angles are congruent in a square. So a square can be considered a rhombus. But a rhombus cannot be considered a square because all of their angles are not congruent. So the first thing we can notice about a kite is that it is not a parallelogram. There are not 2 sets of parallel sides on the shape. And up until now, the rectangle, square, and rhombus had all been considered parallelograms as well. But since a kite can't fall into that category, it becomes its own category in itself. So the first attribute of a kite is that it has 2 pairs of sides. So here is one pair of sides, and here is another pair of sides. Another attribute of a kite is that the 2 pairs of sides are actually going to be equal in length. So if you see here, the two red sides are equal in length and the 2 blue sides are equal in length. And they're also going to be adjacent, which means they're next to each other. So here's where they meet and here's where they meet. So obviously these are going to be considered adjacent because they are meeting, they are next to each other. So let's go back to a rhombus because these sound very similar to the attributes of a rhombus as well. So let's see, the first attribute is that there's 2 pairs of sides. On a rhombus, are there 2 pairs of sides? Yeah, we have 4 sides here. They can be split up into 2 pairs. And they are all congruent and equal to each other because all of the sides in a rhombus are equal to each other. So a rhombus can actually also be considered a kite. So a rhombus is 3 things. It's a parallelogram, a kite, and a rhombus. But a kite is, like I said, its own classification. It doesn't fall under parallelogram, so it becomes its own category. So a trapezoid is going to be a quadrilateral with only 1 pair of parallel lines. So as you can see, these extend forever without intersecting, but these would not. They would eventually meet and intersect. So there is only 1 pair of parallel lines in a trapezoid. Since we know that there's not 2 sets of parallel lines, we know that this cannot be considered a parallelogram. We can also go back to the kite and look at their attributes, and we can see that a kite needs pairs of lines that are equal and adjacent. If we look at our trapezoid, we can see that there's 1 set of equal and adjacent lines, but the other pair of adjacent lines are definitely not equal. So it can't be considered a kite either. So since it's not a kite or a parallelogram, a trapezoid just becomes its own category. So now we have three main categories: a trapezoid, a kite, and a parallelogram. So an isosceles trapezoid is a type of trapezoid that is going to be congruent when you split it in half. So it's going to have symmetry. So if I draw a line down the middle, well, it's close to the middle. If you were to fold it in half, it would be equal horizontally. Now, just like a normal trapezoid, there is still one set of parallel lines, as you can see here. But there's also going to be congruent opposite sides. So the opposite sides are going to be the same length in a isosceles trapezoid. Okay, so here is just a little bit of a flowchart that can help put everything that we just talked about into a nice organized display that you can use to help you when you're trying to classify your quadrilaterals. So let's start off with this question right here. How many pairs of parallel sides? So say your shape has 0 pairs of parallel sides, then you would get a kite, and you know that that's a kite. If your shape has 1 pair of parallel sides, then you're looking at a trapezoid. If your shape has 2 pairs of parallel, then you get brought over here to this question. Are the 4 sides equal? So if your shape has 2 parallel sides and the 4 sides are equal, then you would go down and you would say yes, and you would go down to this question. Are the 4 corners 90 degrees? If your answer is no, the 4 corners are not 90 degrees, then you would have a rhombus. But if your answer is yes, then you would have a square. So then if we go back up to this question, are the 4 sides equal? If you answered no, your 4 sides are not equal, they are not the same length, then you would go down to this next question. Are the 4 corners 90 degrees? If the 4 corners are not 90 degrees, then you know that you have a parallelogram. But if the 4 corners are 90 degrees, then you know that you have a rectangle. I have also posted this graphic organizer in the next slide, so when you're working on your interactive slides, make sure to use this to reference and help you.